Good day, everyone. Welcome to our group presentation for DBA5214, Economic Dynamics, Understanding Markets, Policies and Growth. Our case study is titled Energy Price Shocks and Inflation Dynamics, an economic analysis of Malaysia's policy response. I'm Rosania, and I'm honored to be joined by my fellow DBA candidates, Lynn, Ruby, Betty, and Muzzy. The presentation begins with a focus on energy price shocks, a major factor driving macroeconomics instability worldwide. For energy importing economies like Malaysia, such shocks influence inflation, employment, and economic growth through higher production and transportation costs. Between 2021 and 2023, global disruptions from the post-pandemic supply constraints and the Russia-Ukraine conflict created significant stress on Malaysia's economic resilience. During this period, Brent crude prices rose sharply from $70 in 2021 to $101 in 2022, before easing to $83 in 2023. Consequently, Malaysia's headline inflation followed a similar path, increasing from 2.5% to 3.3% and then moderating back to 2.5%. The government's dual policy approach combined extensive fuel subsidies amounting to about 77 ringgit Malaysia to 80 billion, with a monetary tightening cycle by Bank Negara Malaysia, which raised the overnight policy rate from 1.7% to 3%. These responses illustrate Malaysia's application of Keynesian stabilization principles designed to maintain household consumption while preventing inflation expectations from escalating. In this study, our objective is to analyze how Malaysia responded to these global energy shocks using both theoretical and empirical perspectives. Specifically, we analyze the macroeconomics impact of the 2021 to 2023 energy price shocks, apply key economic models such as the aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework, and the Phillips curve to understand inflation dynamics, evaluate the effectiveness and trade-offs of fiscal and monetary measures, assess the implications for Malaysia's short and long-term growth and fiscal sustainability. The relevance of this research lies in linking economic theory to real-world practice. It shows how Malaysia balanced growth and inflation during a global energy crisis, offering valuable policy insights for future resilience and the nation's transition towards sustainable energy management. With that, let me pass this presentation to Lynn, who will delve into literature that we have collectively reviewed.
Thank you, Rosania. To begin, let's explore how the aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework explains the effects of energy price shock on the economy. In macroeconomics, energy is a crucial production input, from powering factories to fueling transportation. When oil and gas prices rise sharply, as they did between year 2021 and 2022, the cost of producing goods and delivering services also increases. This phenomenon is described by Killian as a negative supply shock, which shifts the short-run aggregate supply curve to the left. This shift leads to higher prices and lower real output, a situation known as cost-push inflation. At the same time, the fall in output leads to higher unemployment, creating what we call a stagflationary effect. Inflation is rising while growth slows, as noted by Blanchard and Gully. Modern research, however, suggests that the impact of such shocks today is less severe than in the 1970s. According to De Gregorio, this is largely because global economies are now more energy efficient, and central banks have become better at managing inflation's expectations. In Malaysia's case, this framework helps explain why inflation rose modestly, from 2.5% to 3.3%, instead of spiraling out of control. Although energy costs increase, policy coordinations and improved institutional credibility soften the shock's full impact. The model essentially shows how macroeconomic stability depends on the ability to balance supply constraints with effective policy responses. Next, the Phillips curve helps us understand the evolving relationship between inflation and unemployment during an energy shock. Traditionally, the Phillips curve shows a short-run trade-off when unemployment decreases. Inflation tends to rise and vice versa. However, when economics face a supply shock, such as the energy crisis between year 2021 and 2023, this relationship becomes distorted. The entire curve shifts outward as Miskin explained, resulting in higher inflations for any given level of unemployment. In more recent times, economists like Del Negro have observed that the Phillips curve has become flatter, meaning that changes in unemployment have a smaller impact on inflation. Despite this flattening, supply shocks can still cause price spikes, especially when firms easily pass on increased production costs to consumers. This was reaffirmed by L. Hillier and Phelan. For policymakers, this presents a dilemma where inflation driven by supply shocks does not always signal an overheated economy. Instead, it reflects external cost pressures, not excessive domestic demand. In Malaysia's context, this is precisely what happened. Despite moderate inflation, and employment continued to improve from 3.9% to 3.4%, demonstrating a flatter and more stable Phillips curve. This dynamic indicates that Bank Negara Malaysia's monetary policy was credible enough to anchor expectations without sacrificing employment. The final component of the theoretical framework examines how policymakers respond to energy price shock through monetary and fiscal policies. From the monetary side, central banks often face a difficult balancing act. Keeping interest rates low supports economic growth, but risks embedding inflation's expectations, as warned by Burnham. On the other hand, raising interest rates too aggressively can cool inflation, but also deepen a slowdown, a dilemma described by Crederida. The Bank for International Settlements highlights that in today's unpredictable environment, energy shocks can no longer be ignored. Central banks must respond gradually to maintain credibility. From the fiscal side, governments often intervene through subsidies to cushion households and firms from high energy prices. While these subsidies provide short-term relief, Azimoglu point out several downsides. They distort market signals, increase fiscal burdens, and slow down the transitions to renewable energy. The key takeaway from the literature is that effective policy design requires a balance between short-term protections and long-term sustainability. Modern macroeconomic thinking emphasizes credibility, expectations management, and fiscal discipline as the foundations for resilience. As we will see in the case of Malaysia, these principles were central to its year 2021 to 2023 policy response, combining targeted fiscal support with measured monetary tightening to preserve stability while avoiding deeper structural imbalances. For the case analysis, I now pass these presentations to Obi and Betty. Over to you.
Thank you, Ms. Lin. I'll begin by framing Malaysia's economic context during the post-pandemic energy price shock from 2021 to 2023. What happened in this period? The global economy reopened, oil demand rebounded sharply, but supply lagged. Then came the Russian-Ukraine conflict. As a result, Brent crude rose from USD 70 in 2021 to USD 101 in 2022 before easing USD 83 in 2023. In Malaysia, inflation rose from 2.5 to 3.3%, then moderated to 2.5%. GDP jumped 8.7% in 2022, the fastest in 2 decades, and stabilized around 3.6% in 2023. Unemployment declined steadily to 3.4%. Theoretically, this is a cost-push inflation episode. In the aggregated supply and aggregated demand framework, higher oil prices shift the short-run aggregated supply leftward, prices rise, output fall. Yet, Malaysia didn't slip into stagflation. Why? Because policy coordination worked. Fiscal subsidies absorbed part of the cost shock, while moderated monetary tightening stabilized expectation. A clear example of condition short-run stabilization, where government spending and price control sustained demand, while central bank credibility maintains confidence. So, one big question: why did Malaysia's economy remain resilient during the global turbulence? The answer: timely coordination of fiscal and monetary policies prevented the inflation output trade-off from spiraling. Now that we've set the macro context, let's see how these policies were actually implemented both at the fiscal and monetary level. So how did Malaysia put these policies into action? Let's start with the fiscal measures. The government kept RON 95 petrol at RM2.05 and diesel at RM2.15 beginning February 2021. That decision absorbed the price difference when global oil surge, costing about 77 billion or roughly 4% of the GDP in 2022. This provided immediate relief to the households and SMEs. But what about the monetary side? After keeping the overnight policy rate OPR at 1.75% during the pandemic, Bank Negara Malaysia began gradual tightening cycle. 25 basis points in each May, July, September, November 22 and reaching 2.75% and one final move to 3% in May 2023. Why gradual? Because each step acted like a pulse check, tightening just enough to anchor inflation expectation without suppressing recovery. This mirrors what economic Marco Del Negro of the Federal Reserve Bank, New York observed. Modern Phillips curves has flattened, meaning inflation reacts less sharply to lower unemployment. Thus, Malaysia data fits this modern view. Inflation fell from 3.3 to 2.5%, while unemployment improved from 3.9 to 3.4%. That's credible monetary signaling at work. So how did policy coordination sustain balance? Through fiscal cushioning at the micro level and credible monetary guidance at the macro level. Now let's examine what the data tell us about the actual outcomes, how these shocks and responses translate into real economic trend. Looking at the data side by side, a few patterns stands out. The World Bank shows that global energy prices rise 65% in 2022 and falling 24% in 2023. Yet Malaysian inflation remained moderate, peaking at 3.3%, well below Thailand 6.1% and Indonesia 5.5%. Why the differences? Because fuel price ceiling and subsidies that cushion consumers. But this stability had a cost. What Katiba et al.'s 2020 called a sticky downward inflation, where prices climbed quickly with the oil surge but eased only slightly when the cost fell. Malaysia's CPI slipped just to 2.5%. The stickiness came from logistic, wage and input costs that don't adjust overnight, while subsidy muted through market signals. So Malaysians avoided a price spike by locked in a higher cost base, achieving short-term stability at the expense of a long-term fiscal strain. To take that further, Ruby will now evaluate how effective these micro and macro strategies were and discuss Malaysia's long-term policy implications.
Malaysia's adjustments to energy shock can be viewed through both microeconomic and macroeconomic perspectives. At the micro level, fuel price ceilings were implemented to keep prices stable for consumers and businesses. While this policy protected purchasing power, it disrupted the natural market equilibrium. Prices set below equilibrium levels created excess demand and increased fiscal costs, confirming the classical law of supply and demand effect described by Marshall. At the macro level, the sharp rise in global energy prices shifted the short-run aggregate supply curve leftwards, driving cost push inflation. The government subsidies, however, shifted aggregate demand slightly to the right, cushioning the decline in output. As inflationary pressures widened, Bank Negara Malaysia carefully increased the OPR in small sequential steps, totaling 125 basis points to maintain inflation expectation while sustaining recovery. Empirical comparisons show that this calibrated tightening was effective. Malaysia maintained positive growth, while countries like Thailand and the Philippines experienced weaker output. This reinforces the argument that Malaysia's inflation stemmed mainly from supply-side shocks, not excessive money supply, a direct contrast to Friedman's monetarist view. The short and long-run effects of Malaysia's coordinated fiscal and monetary responses reflect the trade-offs between stability and sustainability. In the short run, subsidies and price control sustained consumption and protected employment. Household spending remained stable and unemployment fell to 3.4%, demonstrating the success of Keynesian multiplier effects. However, food inflation of 5.8% slightly reduced real incomes, and SMEs faced thinner profit margins despite stable logistic costs. In the long run, the around 77 to 80 billion subsidy will constrain Malaysia's capacity to invest in innovation and infrastructure. Recognizing this, the government began rationalizing subsidies and introduced targeted B40 cash transfers and incentives for renewable energy under Budget 2026. Structural reforms, including expansion of B20 biodiesel and tax rebates for green technologies, are expected to boost productivity and shift the long-run aggregate supply curve rightward. Ultimately, Malaysia's future resilience will depend on phasing out blanket subsidies, investing in renewable energy, and fostering technological advancement. These reforms will ensure long-term fiscal sustainability while supporting inclusive growth. For the next segment on policy and strategy evolution, I will now hand it over to Mazwin.
Thank you, Ruby. To evaluate Malaysia's response to the 2021 until 2023 global energy shock, we begin with the government's dual policy approach, a combination of broad subsidies and gradual monetary tightening. On the fiscal side, subsidies for fuel, electricity and cooking oil reached approximately Rm 77 billion, around 4% of GDP. This helped offset the sharp rise in import costs and stabilize household consumption when global oil prices peaked. This transfer shifted demand upwards and cushioned the contraction from higher production costs. Malaysia kept RON 95 at Rm 2.05 and diesel at Rm 2.50, keeping inflation contained at 3.3% while GDP growth accelerated to 8.7%. On the monetary front, Bank Negara Malaysia raised the overnight policy rate in calibrated steps from 1.75% to 3%. The results were clear. Inflation remained moderate, growth rebounded strongly, and unemployment improved to 3.4%. In short, Malaysia achieved short-term stability, but at a long-term fiscal cost. Meanwhile, on the policy effectiveness and trade-offs, Malaysia's coordinated fiscal and monetary response proved highly effective in the short run. Inflation stayed low at 3.3%, about half that of Thailand's 6.1% and Indonesia's 5.5%. GDP expanded by 8.7% in 2022 and employment returned to pre-pandemic levels. This performance demonstrates the effectiveness of Keynesian counter-cyclical policy, where targeted spending sustains demands while monetary tightening prevents inflationary spirals. Yet, there were unavoidable trade-offs. The massive subsidy bill strained fiscal sustainability, limiting resources for infrastructure and green energy transition. Universal subsidies diluted equity as the M40 and T20 household benefited as much as the B40 group. At the same time, price controls delayed behavioral shifts and reduced innovation in energy efficiency. The continued reliance on subsidy also created moral hazard, where both firms and consumers expect ongoing government protection. Despite these trade-offs, Malaysia managed to maintain macroeconomic equilibrium. Growth, inflation, and employment remain balanced largely due to credible central bank communication and disciplined policy execution. Looking ahead, Malaysia's policy direction must evolve from crisis stabilization to structural reform. The first step is targeted subsidy rationalization, replacing blanket fuel support with digital cash transfer for B40 household. This preserves equity while allowing market-based price signals to improve efficiency. Second, redirect fiscal saving towards green transition investment, expanding B20 biodiesel, offering renewable energy rebates and promoting clean technology adoption. Third, implement fiscal rules and sunset clauses that cap subsidies as a percentage of GDP and automatically phase them out unless reviewed. This ensures long-term discipline and predictability. And finally, private sector's incentives such as tax credits from energy-saving technologies can complement government reforms by driving productivity gains. Together, these measures support Budget 2026 objective and align with Malaysia's 2050 renewable energy target. In summary, Malaysia's short-run success prevented stagflation and preserved growth. But the next phase must shift towards innovation-led, sustainable growth, combining key nations' sustainability in short run with Roma Lucas' long-run productivity dynamics. That's how Malaysia can transform fiscal resilience into long-term competitiveness. With that, I'll now pass it back to Rosania to conclude this presentation.
Thank you, Mazwin. To conclude, our analysis highlights that Malaysia's macroeconomic stability during 2021 to 2023 energy shock was not by chance. It was a result of decisive fiscal and monetary coordination. Despite the global surge in oil prices, inflation was contained at 3.3% and GDP grew by 8.7%, largely due to credible monetary management by Bank Negara Malaysia and strategic subsidies that shielded households. However, this short-term success came with long-term costs, fiscal rigidity, delayed subsidy reform, and reduced fiscal space for future investments. Moving forward, Malaysia must pivot from cushioning consumption to building resilience. Three key priorities stand out. First, adopt transparent, data-driven energy pricing to global trends with direct cash support for B40 groups. Second, ensure continuous fiscal monetary coordination to maintain policy credibility. And third, to direct savings into renewable energy and productivity investments to drive sustainable, innovation-led growth. In essence, Malaysia's journey through energy shock proves that stability is not a destination, it's an evolving process. By combining credible institutions, evidence-based solutions, and forward-looking reforms, Malaysia can transform short-term challenges into long-term competitive advantage. Our final takeaway is strong policy agility today will define the nation's economic resilience tomorrow. Thank you.